The structure of the posterior abdominal wall. General arrangement of the abdominal viscera liver. The liver is a large organ that occupies the upper part of the abdominal cavity. The liver lies almost entirely under the cover of the ribs and costal cartilages and extends across the epigastric region. The liver is located in the upper right-hand portion of the abdominal cavity, beneath the diaphragm, and on top of the stomach, right kidney, and intestines. The liver is shaped like a cone. The liver is a dark reddish-brown organ that weighs about 3 pounds. As the largest organ in our body, our liver has 3 vital functions. It is essential to our body detoxification, synthesis, and also it serves as a storage of the body. The gallbladder is a pear-shaped sac that is adherent to the undersurface of the right lobe of the liver. Its blind end or fundus projects below the inferior border of the liver. The gallbladder is a gastrointestinal organ located within the right hypochondrial region of the abdomen. This intraperitoneal pear-shaped sac lies within a fossa form between the inferior aspects of the right and quadrate lobes of the liver. The gallbladder stores bile produced by the liver, so after meals, the gallbladder is empty and flat like a deflated balloon. So before a meal, the gallbladder may be full of bile and about the size of a small pear. The gallbladder is an organ that's found in their abdomen. So its function is to store bile until it's needed for digestion. A gallbladder functions as a concentrating reservoir for bile, which it delivers to the duodenum in response to meals. So when we eat, the gallbladder contracts or squeezes to send bile into the digestive tract. Esophagus. The esophagus is a tubular structure that joins the pharynx to the stomach. The esophagus pierces the diaphragm slightly to the left of the midline and after a short course of about 0.5 inches or 1.25 centimeter enters the stomach on its right side. It is deeply placed, lying behind the left lobe of the liver. The esophagus conducts food from the pharynx into the stomach. A wave-like contractions of the muscular coat called peristalsis, which is propelled the food onward. The esophagus is related anteriorly to the posterior surface of the left lobe of the liver and posteriorly to the left crus. Stomach. The stomach is a dilated part of the alimentary canal between the esophagus and the small intestine. It occupies the left upper quadrant, epigastric, and umbilical regions, and much of it lies under cover of the ribs. So the stomach is a dilated portion of the alimentary canal and has 3 main functions. First, it stores food, or in adult, it has a capacity of about 1,500 ml. It mixes the food with gastric secretions to form a semi-fluid chyme. Second, it controls the rate of delivery of the chyme to the small intestine so that efficient digestion and absorption can take place. So the stomach is situated in the upper part of the abdomen, extending from beneath the left costal margin region into the epigastric and umbilical regions. So much of the stomach lies under cover of the lower ribs. A stomach is a roughly J-shape and has 2 openings, the cardiac and pyloric orifices, 2 curvatures, the greater and lesser curvatures, and 2 surfaces, an anterior and posterior surface. Small intestine. The small intestine is divided into 3 regions, duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. So the small intestine is the longest part of the alimentary canal and extends from the pylorus of the stomach to the ileocecal junction. So the greater part of digestion and food absorption takes place in the small intestine. So like what I said, it is divided into 3 parts, the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. So one of the functions of the small intestine is that small intestine carries out most of the digestive process, absorbing almost all of the nutrients you get from foods into your bloodstream. So the walls of the small intestine make digestive juices or enzymes that work together with enzymes from the liver and pancreas to do this. Large intestine. The large intestine is divided into the cecum, appendix, ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, sigmoid colon, rectum, and anal canal. So the large intestine extends from the ileum to the anus. Like what I said, it is divided into the cecum, appendix, ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, and sigmoid colon. So the rectum and anal canal are considered in the sections on the pelvis and perineum. So the primary function of the large intestine is the absorption of water and electrolytes and the storage of an undigested material until it can be expelled from the body as feces. So the purpose of the large intestine is to absorb water and salts from the material that has not been digested as food, and get rid of any waste products left over. By the time food mixed with digestive juices reaches your large intestine, most digestion and absorption has already taken place. Pancreas. So the pancreas is a soft, lobulated organ that stretches obliquely across the posterior abdominal wall in the epigastric region. So the pancreas is an elongated structure that lies in the epigastrium and the left upper quadrant. It is soft and lobulated and situated on the posterior abdominal wall behind the peritoneum. It crosses the transpyloric plane. The pancreas is divided into a head, neck, body, and tail. The pancreas is both an exocrine and endocrine gland. The exocrine portion of the gland produces a secretion that contains enzymes capable of hydrolyzing proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. So the endocrine portion of the gland, the pancreatic islets or islets of Langerhans, produces the hormones insulin and glucagon, which play a key role in carbohydrate metabolism. Spleen. The spleen is a soft mass of lymphatic tissue that occupies the left upper part of the abdomen between the stomach and the diaphragm. It lies along the long axis of the 10th left rib. So the spleen is reddish and is the largest single mass of lymphoid tissue in the body. It is oval shaped and has a notched anterior border. It lies just beneath the left half of the diaphragm, close to the 9th, 10th, and 11th ribs. So the long axis lies along the shaft of the 10th rib, and its lower pole extends forward only as far as the mid-axillary line and cannot be palpated on clinical examination. So the spleen is surrounded by a peritoneum, which passes from it at the hilum as a gastrosplenic omentum or ligament to the greater curvature of the stomach, or carrying the short gastric and left gastroepiploic vessels. Kidneys. The kidneys are two reddish-brown organs situated high up on the posterior abdominal wall, one on each side of the vertebral column. So the two kidneys function to excrete most of the waste products of metabolism. They play a major role in controlling the water and electrolyte balance within the body, and in maintaining the acid-base balance of the blood. The right kidney lies slightly lower than the left kidney because of the large size of the right lobe of the liver. With contraction of the diaphragm during respiration, both kidneys move downward in a vertical direction by as much as 1 inch or 2.5 centimeter. Suprarenal glands. The suprarenal glands are two yellowish organs that lie on the upper poles of the kidneys on the posterior abdominal wall. So the two suprarenal glands are yellowish retroperitoneal organs that lie on the upper poles of the kidneys. They are surrounded by renal fascia, or but are separated from the kidneys by the perirenal fat. So each gland has a yellow cortex and a dark brown medulla. The right suprarenal gland is pyramid-shaped and cups the upper pole of the right kidney. It lies behind the right lobe of the liver and extends medially behind the inferior vena cava. It rests posteriorly on the diaphragm. So the left suprarenal gland is crescentic in shape and extends along the middle border of the left kidney from the upper pole to the hilus. It lies behind the pancreas, the lesser sac, and the stomach and rests posteriorly on the diaphragm. Peritoneum, or general arrangement. The peritoneum is a thin serous membrane that lines the walls of the abdominal and pelvic cavities and clothes the viscera. The peritoneum can be regarded as a balloon against which organs are pressed from outside. So the parietal peritoneum lines the walls of the abdominal and pelvic cavities, and the visceral peritoneum covers the organs. The potential space between the parietal and visceral layers, which is in effect the inside space of the balloon, is called the peritoneal cavity. In males, this is a closed cavity, but in females, there is communication with the exterior through the uterine tubes, the uterus, and the vagina. Between the parietal peritoneum and the fascial lining of the abdominal and pelvic walls is a layer of connected tissue called the extraperitoneal tissue. In the area of the kidneys, this tissue contains a large amount of fat which supports the kidneys. The peritoneal cavity is the largest cavity in the body and is divided into two parts, the greater sac and the lesser sac. The greater sac is the main compartment and extends from the diaphragm down into the pelvis, while the lesser sac is smaller and lies behind the stomach. The greater and lesser sacs are in free communication with one another through a oval window called the opening of the lesser sac, or the epiploic foramen. The peritoneum secretes a small amount of serous fluid, the peritoneal fluid, which lubricates the surfaces of the peritoneum and allows free movement between the viscera. Intraperitoneal and retroperitoneal relationships. The terms intraperitoneal and retroperitoneal are used to describe the relationship of the various organs to their peritoneal covering. An organ is said to be intraperitoneal when it is almost totally covered with the visceral peritoneum. So the stomach, jejunum, ileum, and spleen are good examples of intraperitoneal organs, while the retroperitoneal organs lie behind the peritoneum and are only partially covered with the visceral peritoneum. The pancreas and the ascending and descending parts of the colon are examples of retroperitoneal organs. No organ, however, is actually within the peritoneal cavity. An intraperitoneal organ, such as the stomach, appears to be surrounded by the peritoneal cavity, but it is covered with visceral peritoneum and is attached to other organs by ommenta.
Peritoneal ligaments. Peritoneal ligaments are two layered folds of peritoneum that connect solid viscera to the abdominal walls. The liver, for example, is connected to the diaphragm by the falciform ligament, the coronary ligament, and the right and the left triangular ligaments. Ommenta. The greater omentum, it hangs down like an apron in front of the coils of the small intestine and it's folded back on itself to be attached to the transverse colon. The lesser omentum suspends the lesser curvature of the stomach from the fissure of the ligamentum venosum and the porta hepatis on the undersurface of the liver. The gastrosplenic omentum or ligament connects the stomach to the hilum of the spleen. Mesenteries. The peritoneal ligaments, ommenta, and mesenteries permit blood, lymph vessels, and nerves to reach the viscera. The extent of the peritoneum and the peritoneal cavity should be studied in the transverse and sagittal sections of the abdomen. Peritoneal pouches, recesses, spaces, and gutter. In lesser sac, the left margin of the sac is formed by the spleen and the gastrosplenic omentum and splenorenal ligament. The right margin opens into the greater sac or the main part of the peritoneal cavity through the opening of the lesser sac or epiploic foramen. Transverse section of the lesser sac showing the arrangement of the peritoneum in the formation of the lesser omentum, the gastrosplenic omentum, and the splenorenal ligament. The opening into the lesser sac or epiploic foramen has the following boundaries: the anteriorly free border of the lesser omentum, the bile duct, the hepatic artery, and the portal vein, and posteriorly inferior vena cava, superiorly caudate process of the caudate lobe of the liver, and inferiorly the first part of the duodenum. Recesses. Close to the duodenojejunal junction, there may be four small pocket-like pouches of peritoneum called the superior duodenal, inferior duodenal, paraduodenal, and retroduodenal recesses. Duodenal recesses are peritoneal recesses surrounding duodenum. Sometimes coils of small intestine may enter these recesses, known as internal hernia, and may get strangulated. Cecal recesses. Folds of peritoneum close to the cecum produce three peritoneal recesses called the superior ileocecal, the inferior ileocecal, and the retrocecal recesses. The superior ileocecal recess or fossa is formed by a fold of peritoneum or the vascular fold of cecum, arching over the branch of the ileocolic artery which supplies the ileocolic junction. The intersigmoid recess. Intersigmoid recess is situated at the apex of the inverted V-shaped root of the sigmoid mesocolon. Its mouth opens downward. The intersigmoid fossa or intersigmoid recess corresponds, when it exists, to a V-shaped peritoneal recess, which is a cul-de-sac with variable dimensions, situated between the two roots of the parietal brim of the sigmoid mesocolon. Subphrenic spaces. The right and the left anterior subphrenic spaces lie between the diaphragm and the liver, on each side of the falciform ligament. The right posterior subphrenic space lies between the right lobe of the liver, the right kidney, and the right colic flexure. The subphrenic space is a peritoneal space between the anterior part of the liver and the diaphragm. It is separated into right and left by the falciform ligament, and posterior-superiorly bounded by the coronary ligaments. Paracolic gutters. The right and left paracolic gutters are peritoneal recesses on the posterior abdominal wall lying alongside the ascending and descending colon. The main paracolic gutter lies lateral to the colon on each side. It is continuous with the peritoneum as it descends into the pelvis over the pelvic brim. The nerve supply of the peritoneum. The parietal peritoneum lining the anterior abdominal wall is supplied by the lower six thoracic and first lumbar nerves, that is, the same nerves that innervate the overlying muscles and skin. The central part of the diaphragmatic peritoneum is supplied by the phrenic nerves. Peripherally, the diaphragmatic peritoneum is supplied by the lower six thoracic nerves. The parietal peritoneum in the pelvis is mainly supplied by the obturator nerve, a branch of the lumbar plexus, while the visceral peritoneum it is supplied by the autonomic afferent nerves that supply the viscera or are traveling in the mesenteries. Overdistension of viscous leads to the sensation of pain. The mesenteries of the small and large intestines are sensitive to mechanical stretching. Functions of the peritoneum. As a result of the movements of the diaphragm and the abdominal muscles, together with the peristaltic movements of the intestinal tract, the peritoneal fluid is not static. Experimental evidence has shown that particulate matter introduced into the lower part of the peritoneal cavity reaches the subphrenic peritoneal spaces rapidly, whatever the position of the body. It seems that intraperitoneal movement of fluid toward the diaphragm is continuous, and there it is quickly absorbed into the subperitoneal lymphatic capillaries. This can be explained on the basis that the area of peritoneum is extensive in the region of the diaphragm, and the respiratory movements of the diaphragm aid lymph flow in the lymph vessels. The peritoneal coverings of the intestine tend to stick together in the presence of infection. The greater omentum, which is kept constantly on the move by the peristalsis of the neighboring intestinal tract, and may adhere to other peritoneal surfaces around focus of infection. In this manner, many of the intraperitoneal infections are sealed off and remain localized. And lastly, a large amounts of fat are stored in the peritoneal ligaments and mesenteries, and especially large amounts can be found in the greater omentum.
Now let's talk about the gastrointestinal tract. The esophagus is a muscular collapsible tube about 10 inches long that joins the pharynx to the stomach. It enters the abdomen through an opening in the right crust of the diaphragm. After a course of about half an inch, it enters the stomach on its right side. There is no anatomic sphincter exists at the lower end of the esophagus. However, the circular layer of smooth muscle in this region serves as a physiologic sphincter. As the food descends through the esophagus, relaxation of the muscle at the lower end occurs ahead of the peristaltic wave so that the food enters the stomach. The tonic contraction of this sphincter prevents the stomach contents from regurgitating into the esophagus. The stomach is a dilated portion of the alimentary canal and has three main functions. First, it stores food. Second, it mixes the food with gastric secretions to form a semi-fluid chyme. Third, it controls the rate of delivery of the chyme to the small intestine so that the efficient digestion and absorption can take place. The stomach is divided into the following parts: fundus, body, pyloric antrum, and pylorus. Fundus is dome-shaped and projects upward and to the left of the cardiac orifice. It is usually full of gas. The body extends from the level of the cardiac orifice to the level of the incisura angularis, a constant notch in the lower part of the lesser curvature. The pyloric antrum extends from the incisura angularis to the pylorus. Pylorus is the most tubular part of the stomach. The thick muscular wall is called the pyloric sphincter, and the cavity of the pylorus is the pyloric canal. The cardiac orifice is where the esophagus enters the stomach. Although no anatomic sphincter can be demonstrated here, a physiologic mechanism exists that prevents regurgitation of stomach contents into the esophagus. The pylorus lies on the transpyloric plane, and its position can be recognized by a slight constriction on the surface of the stomach. The sphincter receives motor fibers from the sympathetic system and inhibitory fibers from the vagi. The peritoneum completely surrounds the stomach. It leaves the lesser curvature as the lesser omentum and the greater curvature as the gastrosplenic omentum and the greater omentum. The anterior vagal trunk, formed in the thorax mainly from the left vagus nerve, enters the abdomen on the anterior surface of the esophagus. The posterior vagal trunk, formed in the thorax, mainly from the right vagus nerve, enters the abdomen on the posterior surface of the esophagus. The sympathetic innervation of the stomach carries a proportion of pain-transmitting nerve fibers, whereas the parasympathetic vagal fibers are secretomotor to the gastric glands and motor to the muscular wall of the stomach. The pyloric sphincter receives motor fibers from the sympathetic system and inhibitory fibers from the vagi. The greater part of digestion and food absorption takes place in the small intestine. It is divided into three parts: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. The duodenum is a C-shaped tube about 10 inches long which joins the stomach to the jejunum. It receives the openings of the bile and pancreatic ducts. The duodenum curves around the head of the pancreas. The first part of the duodenum begins at the pylorus and runs upward and backward to the transpyloric plane at the level of the first lumbar vertebra. The second part of the duodenum runs vertically downward in front of the hilum of the right kidney on the right side of the second and third lumbar vertebrae. About halfway down its medial border, the bile duct and the main pancreatic duct pierce the duodenal wall. They unite to form the ampulla that opens in the summit of the major duodenal papilla. The accessory pancreatic duct, if present, opens into the duodenum a little higher up on the minor duodenal papilla. The third part of the duodenum runs horizontally to the left on the subcostal plane, passing in front of the vertebral column and following the lower margin of the head of the pancreas. The fourth part of the duodenum runs upward and to the left of the duodenojejunal flexure. The flexure is held in position by a peritoneal fold, the ligament of Treitz, which is attached to the right crus of the diaphragm. The mucous membrane of the duodenum is thick. In the first part of the duodenum, it is smooth. In the remainder of the duodenum, it is thrown into numerous circular folds called the plicae circularis. At the site where the bile duct and the main pancreatic duct pierce the medial wall of the second part is a small, rounded elevation called the major duodenal papilla. The accessory pancreatic duct, if present, opens into the duodenum on a smaller papilla about 1.9 centimeters above the major duodenal papilla. The jejunum and the ileum measure about 20 feet long. The upper 2/5 of this length make up the jejunum. The jejunum begins at the duodenojejunal flexure and the ileum ends at the ileocecal junction. The coils of jejunum and ileum are freely mobile and are attached to the posterior abdominal wall by a fan-shaped fold of peritoneum known as the mesentery of the small intestine. The long free edge of the fold encloses the mobile intestines.
Large intestine. The large intestine extends from the ileum to the anus. It is divided into the cecum, appendix, ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, and sigmoid colon. The rectum and anal canal are considered in the sections on the pelvis and perineum. The primary function of the large intestine is number 1, the absorption of water and electrolytes, and number 2, the storage of undigested material until it can be expelled from the body as feces. Cecum. The cecum is that part of the large intestine that lies below of the junction of the ileum with the large intestine. It is a blind-ended pouch that is situated in the right iliac fossa. It is about 2.5 inches or 6 centimeter long and is completely covered with peritoneum. The appendix is attached to its posteromedial surface. The presence of peritoneal folds in the vicinity of the cecum creates the superior ileocecal, the inferior ileocecal, and the retrocecal recesses. So as you can see, these are the relations of the cecum anteriorly, posteriorly, and medially. The blood supply of the cecum, the arteries, and the veins. And this is for the lymph drainage and nerve supply of the cecum. Appendix. The appendix is a narrow, muscular tube containing a large amount of lymphoid tissue. It varies in length from 3 to 5 inches. The base is attached to the posteromedial surface of the cecum and about 1 inch below the ileocecal junction. The remainder of the appendix is free. It has a complete peritoneal covering, which is attached to the mesentery of the small intestine by a short mesentery of its own, called the mesoappendix. The mesoappendix contains the appendicular vessels and nerves. The two most common sites for the position of the tip of the appendix is first, when it hangs down into the pelvis against the right pelvic wall, and second, when it is coiled up behind the cecum. And there's the two not so common sites, as you could see in the screen. So here's the blood supply of the appendix. And here's the lymph drainage and nerve supply of the appendix. Ascending colon. The ascending colon is about 5 inches long and lies in the right lower quadrant. It extends upward from the cecum to the interior surface of the right lobe of the liver, where it turns to the left, forming the right colic flexure, and becomes continuous with the transverse colon. The peritoneum covers the front and sides of the ascending colon, binding it to the posterior abdominal wall. So these are the relations of the ascending colon anteriorly and posteriorly. And here's the blood supply of the ascending colon. And also, here's the lymph drainage and nerve supply of the ascending colon. Transverse colon. The transverse colon is about 15 inches long and extends across the abdomen, occupying the umbilical region. It begins to the right colic flexure below the right lobe of the liver, and it hangs downward, suspended by the transverse mesocolon from the pancreas. It then ascends to the left colic flexure below the spleen. The left colic flexure is higher than the right colic flexure and is suspended from the diaphragm by the phrenicolit ligament. So here's the relations of the transverse colon anteriorly and posteriorly. Here's the blood supply of the transverse colon. And here's the lymph drainage and nerve supply of the transverse colon. Descending colon. The descending colon is about 10 inches long and lies in the left upper and lower quadrants. It extends downward from the left colic flexure to the pelvic brim, where it becomes continuous with the sigmoid colon. The peritoneum covers the front and the sides and binds it to the posterior abdominal wall. So here's the relations of the descending colon anteriorly and posteriorly. And here's the blood supply, of course, of the descending colon. And here's the lymph drainage and nerve supply of the descending colon. So the blood supply to the gastrointestinal tract. Here is the arterial supply to the gastrointestinal tract, the celiac artery, the superior mesenteric artery, and the inferior mesenteric artery. So here's the blood supply to the gastrointestinal tract. Here's the venous drainage and nerve supply of the descending colon. The portal vein, or the hepatic portal vein, drains blood from the abdominal part of the gastrointestinal tract from the lower third of the esophagus to halfway down the anal canal. It also drains blood from the spleen, pancreas, and gallbladder. The portal vein enters the liver and breaks up into sinusoids, from which blood passes into the hepatic veins that join the inferior vena cava. The portal vein is about 2 inches long and is formed behind the neck of the pancreas by the union of the superior mesenteric and splenic veins. It ascends to the right behind the first part of the duodenum, and it enters the lesser omentum. It then runs upward in front of the opening into the lesser sac to the porta hepatis, where it divides into right and left terminal branches. So here's the tributaries of the portal vein. The differences between the small and large intestine. So as you could see, there's a picture here, and these are the differences between the small and large intestine externally. And here are the internal differences. Accessory organs of the gastrointestinal tract. For the accessory organs of the gastrointestinal tract, the liver. The liver is the largest gland in the body and has a wide variety of functions. Three of its functions are production and secretion of bile, which is passed into the intestinal tract, involvement in many metabolic activities related to carbohydrate, fat, and protein metabolism, and filtration of the blood, removing bacteria and other foreign particles that have gained entrance to the blood from the lumen of the intestine. Here's the important relations of the liver anteriorly and posteriorly. So, the accessory organs of the gastrointestinal tract. The falciform ligament, which is a two-layered fold of the peritoneum, extends from the umbilicus to the liver. It has a sickle-shaped free margin that contains the ligamentum teres, the remains of the umbilical vein. The falciform ligament passes into the anterior and then the superior surfaces of the liver, and then it splits into two layers. The ligamentum teres passes into a fissure on the visceral surface of the liver, and it joins the left branch of the portal vein into the porta hepatis. The ligamentum venosum, a fibrous band that is the remains of the ductus venosus. It is attached to the left branch of the portal vein, and it ascends in a fissure on the visceral surface of the liver to be attached above the inferior vena cava. The lesser omentum arises from the edges of the porta hepatis and the fissure for the ligamentum venosum and passes down to the lesser curvature of the stomach. So, as you can see, here's the blood supply of the liver. So, the blood circulation through the liver. The blood circulation through the liver, the blood vessels conveying blood to the liver are the hepatic artery, which is 30%, and the portal vein, which is 70%. The hepatic artery brings oxygenated blood to the liver, and the portal vein brings venous blood rich in the products of digestion, which have been absorbed from the gastrointestinal tract. The arterial and venous blood is conducted to the central vein of each liver lobule by the liver sinusoids. The central veins drain into the right and left hepatic veins, and these leave the posterior surface of the liver and open directly into the inferior vena cava. So here's the lymph drainage and nerve supply of the liver. So for the bile ducts of the liver, bile is secreted by the liver cells at a constant rate of about 40 ml per hour. When digestion is not taking place, the bile is stored and concentrated into the gallbladder. Later, it is delivered into the duodenum. The bile ducts of the liver consist of the right and left hepatic ducts, uncommon hepatic duct, the bile duct, the gallbladder, and the cystic duct. The hepatic ducts, the right and left hepatic ducts, emerge from the right and left lobes of the liver in the porta hepatis. After a short pause, the hepatic ducts unite to form the common hepatic duct and the bile duct. The common bile duct, is about 3 inches long. In the first part of its course, it lies in the right free margin of the lesser omentum in front of the opening in the lesser sac. The gallbladder. The gallbladder is a pear-shaped sac lying on the undersurface of the liver. It has a capacity of 30 to 50 ml and stores bile, which it concentrates by absorbing water. The gallbladder is divided into the fundus, body, and neck. The fundus is rounded and projects below the inferior margin of the liver, where it comes to contact with the anterior abdominal wall at the level of the tip of the ninth right costal cartilage. The body lies in contact with the visceral surface of the liver and is directed upward, backward, and to the left. The neck becomes continuous with the cystic duct, which turns into the lesser omentum to join the common hepatic duct. To form the bile duct, the peritoneum completely surrounds the fundus of the gallbladder and binds the body and neck to the visceral surface of the liver. And here's the relation of the gallbladder and anteriorly and posteriorly. So here's the blood supply, lymph drainage, and nerve supply of the gallbladder. So the cystic duct. The cystic duct is about 1.5 inches long and connects the neck of the bladder to the common hepatic duct to form the bile duct. It usually is somewhat S-shaped and descends for a variable distance in the right free margin of the lesser omentum. The mucous membrane of the cystic duct is raised to form a spiral fold that is continuous with a similar fold in the neck of the gallbladder. The fold is commonly known as the spiral valve. The function of the spiral valve is to keep the lumen constantly open. Pancreas. The pancreas is both an exocrine and endocrine gland. The pancreas is an elongated structure that lies in the epigastrium and the left upper quadrant. It is a soft and lobulated and situated on the posterior abdominal wall behind the peritoneum. It crosses the transpyloric plane. The pancreas is divided into a head, neck, body, and tail. The head of the pancreas is disc-shaped and lies within the cavity of the duodenum. A part of the head extends to the left behind the superior mesenteric process and is called the uncinate process. The main duct of the pancreas begins in the tail and runs the length of the gland, receiving numerous tributaries on the way. It opens into the second part of the duodenum at about its middle with a bile duct on the major duodenal papilla. Sometimes the main duct drains separately into the duodenum. So here's the blood supply of the pancreas. And here's the lymph drainage and nerve supply of the pancreas. So for the spleen is a reddish and is the largest single mass of lymphoid tissue in the body. It is a oval shape and has a notched anterior border. It lies just beneath the left half of the diaphragm, close to the 9th, 10th, and 11th ribs. And here's the relation of the spleen anteriorly and posteriorly. So here's the blood supply of the spleen. And of course, here's the lymph drainage and nerve supply of the spleen.
The retroperitoneal space. What is the retroperitoneal space and where is it located? The retroperitoneal space lies on the posterior abdominal wall behind the parietal peritoneum. It extends from the 12th thoracic vertebra and the 12th rib to the sacrum and the iliac crest below. The retroperitoneal space is the anatomical space behind the peritoneum. And now is the urinary tract, and one of the urinary tract is the kidney. And as we can see here in the screen, these are the coverings, the renal structure, the blood supply, the lymph drainage, the nerve supply of the kidney. The kidney are reddish brown and lie behind the peritoneum, high up on the posterior abdominal wall on the either side of the vertebral column. They are largely under cover of the costal margin. The right kidney lies slightly lower than the left kidney because of the large size of the right lobe of the liver. The next would be the ureter, and we can see the blood supply, the lymph drainage, and the nerve supply of the ureter in the screen. The two ureters are muscular tubes that extends from the kidney to the posterior surface of the urinary bladder. The next would be the suprarenal gland, and as you can see in the screen, these are the blood supply, the lymph drainage, and the nerve supply of the suprarenal gland. The two suprarenal glands are yellowish retroperitoneal organs that lie on the upper poles of the kidney. The next would be the arteries on the posterior abdominal wall, and the first one would be the aorta. This artery is responsible for transporting oxygen-rich blood from your heart to the rest of your body. The aorta begins at the left ventricle of the heart, extending upward into the chest to form an arc. For the next one would be the branches of the abdominal aorta. These are the branches of the abdominal aorta. There are three anterior vesical branches, which are the celiac artery, superior mesenteric artery, and inferior mesenteric artery. There are three lateral visceral branches, the suprarenal artery, the renal artery, and the testicular or ovarian artery. There are five lateral abdominal wall branches, which are the inferior phrenic artery and the four lumbar arteries. There are three terminal branches, the two common iliac arteries and the median sacral artery. The next one that we have is the common iliac arteries. These are two large arteries that originate from the aortic bifurcation of the level of the fourth lumbar vertebra. The next one would be the external iliac arteries. The external iliac arteries runs along the medial border of the psoas, following the pelvic brim. It gives off the inferior epigastric and deep circumflex iliac branches. The next one would be the internal iliac artery. The internal iliac artery passes down into the pelvis in front of the sacroiliac joint. The next one would be the veins on the posterior abdominal wall. The first one would be the inferior vena cava. The inferior vena cava conveys most of the blood from the body below the diaphragm to the right atrium of the heart.
Tributaries of inferior vena cava includes: first is the two anterior visceral tributaries, which is the hepatic veins. Second is the three lateral visceral tributaries, which are the right suprarenal vein, renal veins, and the right testicular or ovarian veins. Third is the 5 lateral abdominal wall tributaries, which are the inferior phrenic vein and the 4 lumbar veins. And lastly is the 3 tributaries of origin, which are the 2 common iliac veins and the median sacral vein. Inferior mesenteric vein. The main function of the inferior mesenteric vein is to drain blood from the hindgut, a portion of the gastrointestinal tract that includes the structures from the distal transverse colon to the rectum. Splenic vein. The splenic vein is a large vessel located retroperitoneally in the upper part of the abdominal cavity. The main function of this blood vessel is to drain the venous blood from the spleen. In addition to the spleen, it drains parts of the stomach, pancreas, and the hindgut. Superior mesenteric vein. The superior mesenteric vein is a large vessel in the abdomen. Its function is to drain blood from the small intestine as well as the first sections of the large intestine and other digestive organs. This large vein receives blood from several other veins in the digestive tract. Portal vein. The portal vein or hepatic portal vein is a blood vessel that carries blood from the gastrointestinal tract, gallbladder, pancreas, and spleen to the liver. This blood contains nutrients and toxins extracted from digested contents. Lymphatics of the posterior abdominal wall. Lymph nodes. The primary function of lymph nodes is the filtering of lymph to identify and fight infection. In order to do this, lymph nodes contain lymphocytes, a type of white blood cell which includes B cells and T cells. These circulate through the bloodstream and enter and reside in lymph nodes. Lymph vessels. Lymphatic vessels are the networks of capillaries and a large network of tubes located throughout your body that transport lymph away from tissues. Lymphatic vessels collect and filter lymph as it continues to move toward larger vessels called collecting ducts. Nerves on the posterior abdominal wall. Lumbar plexus. Lumbar plexus is created from lumbal spinal nerves L2, L3, and L4. Its principal function is to supply motor and sensory innervation to the anterior compartment of the thigh. The nerve exits the plexus and enters the femoral triangle, passing just lateral to the femoral artery. Sympathetic trunk. The sympathetic trunk is a fundamental part of the sympathetic nervous system and part of the autonomic nervous system. It allows nerve fibers to travel to spinal nerves that are superior and inferior to the one in which they originated. Aortic plexus. It is well accepted that the aortic plexus is a network of pre- and post-ganglionic nerves overlying the abdominal aorta, which is primarily involved with sympathetic innervation to the mesenteric, pelvic, and urogenital organs.